All right, here we are. Welcome back to Bookwave. Today we're looking at the second half of the Republic, books 6 through 10 today. What were your guys' first impression of these ones?
I don't know what my first impression of reading this book was because, quite frankly, that was lost long ago in the first of the last five books that I read. But some of my last impressions, I can talk to you more. I don't know if you remember, Scott, but a few years ago we had an election, and well, actually, we do this every 4 years in Canada. But the advertising campaign against the liberal potential Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Conservatives were saying he's too young, and he was 42 at the time. And having read The Republic and fully immersing myself in Plato's ideal society and the education required to become a philosopher king, I understand the premise a bit more and can kind of see where they're coming from, because the education has them until 18 training physically and playing games to learn things, and then there's 2 years of some specialized education, and then some 5 years of other education, and then another 10 years of even more education, and then 15 years from the age of 35 to 50 after they've had all of this education and they've developed the mind that is infinite and seeks the truth and understands the good and the arithmetic and the dialectic and all of these wonderful things that he believes will help them to create the philosopher. At 35, they have all the tools that he believes they need. But what they next do, their final set of tests, is 15 years in essentially public service. And this is the final act of their education, that after 15 years, if they've denigrated to a point where they're no longer the men they were when they started and they're considered unfit to be the philosopher king, they won't be. And I think that there's something to be said about this, that you need to live in society and in amongst the crowd and see whether or not you become like the masses, or if you can maintain your steadfast character and your ideals and your principles being exposed to these sorts of climates. And after 15 years, if you come out of it still philosophical and uncorrupted by that, then you get elevated to the place of being one of the many philosopher kings that is obligated to rule and make the decisions in this ideal state. And I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting
Unless
perspective because it kind of implies that it takes that long to weed out all the sophists and the wannabes.
unless they tend to be vicious, then
Yeah.
they're entirely different. But yeah, and also if they remain true to themselves, or I should step back, if they go through all the trials as they age and they do not recognize their own origins for who they are completely useless.
Yeah. And so that was one of my lasting impressions from this section. I mean, they talked a lot about the different forms of government and how they are birthed from the other forms. And there's much to be said about that, and I'm sure we'll get to it. But I really liked that. It really resonated, that the experiential experience is key, that you cannot just go into life attempting to make decisions and rulings without first understanding what it means to live a life. All of the ivory tower lessons in the world will not prepare you for what it's like to work a 9 to 5 with 100 of the proletariats.
And that takes a lot of discipline, too, just to remain steadfast and understanding everything around you and what you know.
What was your first impression, Scott?
Well, he talks quite a bit about the faculties of the soul being reason, understanding, faith, and the perception of shadows. And I just really like the concept of sight being absolutely useless without the intervention of light, and how opinion is about just as useless without the intervention of knowledge.
Yeah, that was really profound. It kind of had an impact on me and my own adventures in having and forming opinions, because there's so many things that I'd love to say I have an opinion about, but you can't, not without true knowledge.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't
And
take away the fact that you hold that opinion, but you just shouldn't put as much stock into that opinion when you know you don't have all the knowledge.
and exactly, so like, and that's where we go back to the 15 years of experience being required to be able to be in a position to make those choices, because you're going to be confronted with hard choices, and if you just were to go at it ideologically and expect the best from what looks great on paper, well, that just sounds like a recipe for the Communist Manifesto.
You have to put it all into practice. And also, Plato mentions the allegory of the cave, and that kind of ties very well with what we're discussing, and how the prisoner is living in this cave with other people, just watching shadows on the wall, until he notices that, oh, this is all staged. And then the people behind the scenes take him out into the real world. He takes his time to experience everything. And then he decides, oh, you know what? I need to bring my friends out of this. And then he goes back and then tells them what he has seen. And then his friends look at him as if he was an alien, you know, just thinking, what is this guy talking about? And the whole point of that was, you know, as far as I can tell, is that it's all about trying to deliver the right desires to the soul. And continuing with that analogy through mind and sight, Socrates brings together this vision of how a clever, wicked man might just be the shape as that of a philosopher.
Yeah, the metaphor of the cave was really interesting, because this is something that I took upon myself a few months ago to actually research. And so to be able to read it in its proper context was cool, because this is like a metaphor for the philosopher in standard society, going out and being enlightened, and then trying to take those absolute truths back to the masses that don't have that experience. How can you teach something to someone who doesn't have the context to understand it? They'd have to take it on faith or reject you entirely. And that was one of several of the very interesting and cool metaphors that were brought up in this section.
And that's pretty much identical to the story of John Galt, who found Atlantis and couldn't bring it to everybody else.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. The other one that I really liked was the, I guess, analogy or metaphor, or whatever you want to call it, of the very large animal. So you have a farmer who has this very large animal, and through experience, he learns what all of the noises this very large animal makes, and when to give it food and when to stay away from it. And in experiencing its reactions, he can understand how to deal with it. That doesn't mean that what he's doing is good for it or bad for it. It just is the reality that this is when it wants food and this is when it wants to be avoided. And then to turn around and teach that, it's not true philosophy, and it's not really anything that he's learned. It's just that he's experienced reactions. And so the metaphor is that the sophists have understood what the populace wants, and so give them what they know to be inciting of a good reaction. That doesn't mean that what they're giving them is good. It's that what they're giving them is what they want, and what they want allows them to feel good and like the sophists, as opposed to the philosopher who attempts to bring the truth to the masses and is oftentimes rejected. You didn't have the very large animal metaphor in your version?
I don't recall that.
Jeez.
Neither do I. And I've read it twice, so...
Oh, let me just see what I can do about that.
He did bring up the concept of democracy and how the differences between wealthy and poor are intersected. Whoever has the most can rule, and those who don't cannot govern a city. But Socrates mentions how flawed it is, because for one thing, the people are just citizens of their own city. It's kind of hard to tell who can be a true ruler. And the second one is it's not just one city holding the rich and poor, but also two cities, and how they have their own factions, how they make up their own livelihood and common arms, and the fact that some of the people are more afraid of who the outsiders are within these two cities. That was one interesting concept right next to the allegory of the cave.
Yeah.
One is harmless and the other one is dangerous, and cannot tell who's who the drones are, who isn't a drone.
I honestly forgot what a drone was, and it took me a minute to realize what a drone was. The whole notion was lost on me for a minute. I just kept picturing like a quadcopter.
Nice. But a drone is like somebody who just is not aware of what's going on, essentially. That's what Socrates was explaining.
I mean, in terms of the bee colony.
Right.
Yeah, he talks about the different forms of government and how naturally how the aristocracy can transform into a timocracy, and how that could transform into an oligarchy, and then into democracy, and then tyranny. But I thought of another example that Plato left out, and that's how a tyranny turns into an anarchy. And that's outlined perfectly in the 5th chapter of V for Vendetta, if you're familiar with that. And the character of V is talking to the statue of Lady Justice right before he's about to blow the thing up. And he just starts kind of talking about how Justice was his one true love ever since he was a child. But he noticed how Justice has been flirting with others. And the culprit is Anarchy. Gives the heart-shaped box of chocolates to Lady Justice and then brings the whole thing down. Just takes one little step to transform an entire system of government. So tyranny isn't the last step, in my opinion. What do you guys think of that?
An interesting turn of events.
That's an interesting argument, because he does make the point that democracy is quite anarchic in nature, because the liberty that is prevalent in a democratic society is in itself anarchic, because it molds the minds of the masses to be so sensitive that any form of restraint becomes perceived as almost intolerable.
Well, that's the thing, though. It keeps swinging to each end of the spectrum. Like, it doesn't go from democracy to anarchy because they're too similar already.
Right.
In a true democracy, when everyone has their say and has their vote, then that has to be taken over by a tyrant to put everybody in order. But then the extreme response to that would be, no, everyone is in charge of everything now. It's all in the hands of the people, no government at all.
Right. And then you'd get something like Mad Max.
Yeah, or martial law afterwards, who knows? Well,
hopefully you'd turn back into the ideal society from there, right? Like, it's like a circle.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. The first time I read this, I kind of saw it as a circle, but now I just kind of see it as a downward slope. But he definitely continues the argument of it being circular when he explains the myth of
Well, we won't go there just yet. Yeah. So, did your versions, because apparently mine is just completely made up, did your versions have anything to do with the weird number math?
There was some, yeah.
So when the ideal society turns into a timarchy, he talks about the gestation period and the math that they use to get the number. I think it's like 276 days. And then there's also like the perfect year, which is a very large random number of months, and it spans about 10 years, I think. And that if the breeding is done poorly, you'll mix gold and silver and get qualities of iron and bronze, and that's what leads to the downfall of the ideal society and translates into a timarchy.
Okay. I don't think there's as much arithmetic in my version, but I think we've got the same idea in our heads.
Okay.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the whole point of democracy, yeah. And the one thing that's missing is the human traits that everyone has, and that harmony is the true purpose of democracy. And without it, it just goes downhill from there. And that everyone should have equal opportunity. And therefore, that's where you can get true democracy.
He seems to be against equal opportunity, though. Did anyone else get that impression?
Well, of course, they've invented their own caste system.
Yeah.
But it was a little bit more progressive than just a simplistic caste system, because he does mention that the people of Goldstock should also take the time to intermingle with everybody else in the state, because the goal of this perfect state isn't for the happiness of the highest class only, it's for everybody in the state. So that he cares about happiness among all of his citizens, but not exactly equal opportunity.
Now, Pat just brought up harmony, and I want to talk about your opinions on the 5 modes of math that he'd like to teach these children, which are arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, astronomy, and harmony. And he goes about it and brings up some interesting points, which I think I will end up translating to my own interactions with people, that it's not about learning math. It's about learning to learn and learning to learn well and learning to think quickly. And that the pursuit of understanding math is very conducive to being able to learn other things. And that many of the traits required in these philosopher kings is the ability to absorb knowledge and to recall knowledge and to be able to learn new things. And he chose math as the pillar that would hold that up. What did you think of that?
That reminds me of just that Musashi quote, once you know the way of one thing, you see the way broadly, or something like that. I butchered it.
Yeah.
But it's once you figure out how to learn something, that makes learning everything else a lot easier too. So I really like how they explain mathematics like that as the language of learning.
Well, one argument I would make about this whole thing is that Socrates got something seriously wrong. And he says that children, you can weed out their characteristics pretty quickly, and that if they don't have the right temperament, that they're not fit to keep going, and that they need to be thrown into a different caste, and that their education needs to be conducive and their society needs to be conducive to the best growth, and that if they stray from the path, that they're doomed to not be what they're looking for, and it's over. And like, I would argue that anybody interested in making change is capable of making change, and that anyone at any point in their life can learn all of these things that for some reason he is structured as linear. Like, if you don't learn it and you don't have the receptiveness to learn it when it's being taught to you, that's game over. It's time to be a shoemaker.
Yeah, I think this is a good spot to insert that quote that we both pulled out.
Did you want to read yours or mine?
I'll read what I had written down. And therefore calculation and geometry and all other elements of instruction, which are a preparation for dialectic, should be presented to the mind in childhood, not, however, under any notion of forcing our system of education. Why not? Because a free man ought not to be a slave in the acquisition of knowledge of any kind. Bodily exercise, when compulsory, does no harm to the body, but knowledge which is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold over the mind.
And I love that quote, because like what we're doing right now is a book club podcast, reading all of the books that we wish we read and think we ought to read, because we've chosen to take that upon ourselves. And I think we're all learning and growing from these books. But when I read Catcher in the Rye in high school, I rejected it entirely. I had no interest in the compulsory education that I was subjected to, on the merit that I needed to learn it because that's what they said, and this is how things are, and this is how things have always been, and this is how things always will be. And now I'm going to go back and read everything I was forced to read on my own terms. And it's ironic.
It was told differently.
Yeah, like when we don't allow humans to understand the purpose that they're being taught, they're going to resist it. And there's got to be a course implemented or injected into the school system that gives teachers and students alike the control over their education and their curriculum so that they can want to learn. Everybody is capable of learning and everybody wants to grow, like, obviously. But for some reason, the way it's set up, it gets rejected. And especially over here in North America, we're not doing a good job of educating our children. And I agree entirely that Socrates is right. If you want to make the ideal society out of a terrible society, take all the kids, send them into the country, and train them properly. And that leads to my parallel that I discovered between this notion that he says, taking the children and educating them, and what Hitler did with his Hitler youth camps. And it kind of horrified me for a brief second.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's a good solution. Just take all the children under 10. That's who you're going to frame your state around. Then just brainwash and indoctrinate these kids so they can't be brainwashed or indoctrinated from their own city-states. Basically the same thing.
Yeah. And it's odd because it removes free will essentially from the equation in the hopes that the means removes free will in the hopes that the end gives you this society that's utopian in nature and allows people to do what they're great at and what they want to do and only what they're great at, nothing else. And there's a lack of freedom, but an apparently higher rate of happiness and unity. And it's very odd. And it's hard to wrap my head around.
Yeah, I feel like Plato just saw that a successful state can't really function unless all the citizens are all united under a common cause or set of values or something, a religion, whatever. But he just didn't know what to make that symbol other than, a brand new state that everyone is loyal to, because that's really the only example that they had, because they were all loyal to Athens or Sparta or whatever it was, and that's really what kept them together. And he just wanted to figure out the perfect methodology of uniting all of the citizens together.
So just before we go for a mid-roll, I think a really good movie, I'm interested in seeing the different sort of states and how they act and what it looks like for the citizens would be like the Lego movie.
Oh.
Have you guys seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't that like so strongly sound right? Like you got this utopian society where everybody has the rules and everybody does their job and everything is awesome when you're part of a team. And then you've got all the other different areas of the Lego universe where you have all sorts of different government. And I'm going to watch it with this new filter of different states.
That'll be a fun experiment to run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's break for a mid-roll, though.
All right. Be right back, folks.
Caw-caw!
And welcome back, lads and ladies, to the Book Wave. We're talking about the Republic today.
So another fun part about reading this section is the entire structure of this whole book. Like, by and large, it was really fun, but it was kind of funny because you get to a point where you're reading and you're reading and you're absorbing and you're absorbing, and then Socrates is like, and so I will answer the question you asked me 7 books ago. Like, oh. Oh,
Kind
you
of
did it.
Yeah, it's kind of a summary.
He's like,
Almost
so
like a
now,
summary.
now I will prove to you that justice is its own reward and an unjust man is not a happier man.
Yes, but we need to talk about a lot before we get there.
And then he also, again, I don't know if you guys had this weird math, but he proves mathematically just how much happier the philosopher
Yes.
king is than the tyrant. I think it was two.
This arithmetic was very clear in mine. And
What was the number?
There's the point where he says that a king is 729 times more happy than a tyrant.
Yeah. And that math is, what, 364 and a half days and 364 and a half nights to a year equals 729. And he really wanted to get to that number, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, there's something funny about the ancient Greeks and their numerology. I don't understand any of it.
We will once we read about Pythagorean stuff.
Yeah.
So essentially that number is better than 42.
Well, I don't know.
I wouldn't make that argument.
Yeah.
I wouldn't die on that hill, Pat. I'm pretty sure the answer is 42.
42 is the answer.
Yeah, there's no argument there. I will not back you on this one. We had a viewer that said we don't agree or we don't disagree all the time. But let me tell you,
I disavow.
Well,
I disavow PatMan.
Okay, let me expand it just a little further. Is 42 the answer to the entire universe, or what Socrates' number is to life on Earth?
Well, let me say this: 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Okay. And the philosopher king is 729 times happier than the tyrant. And I find it fun because if you say for some reason your king only has 1 year in power, well, there's 729 nights or days in that year. And for every instance, at every moment, on every day, and on every night, that king is happier and able to experience all of the pleasures that come from knowledge, experience, and ambition. Whereas the tyrant is subjected to misery and a prisoner to the state that he has created.
Yeah. The other weird part they did with some arithmetic was how poetry and imitation were 3 degrees removed from the truth. So it's 3 degrees inferior to truth. So that's how they justify getting rid of imitative poetry and art in their state.
I really liked that whole monologue there and the Homer bashing that went on in that section. You have a form or a concept. There is a thing that is known to be a bed. And then you have a particular bed made by a carpenter. And then you have the rendition of a view of a bed, which is the painting of a bed. And that art is now 3 degrees separated from the very concept.
You see, none of this really made much sense to me. Like, I know what they were talking about. I know what they were trying to say. But by the end of it, I was just like, the only reason this would be useful is if they had a bunch of people painting pictures of beds and saying, hey, want to buy my bed from me? And trying to commit fraud with a painting of a bed, trying to pass it off as a bed. Like, why is this important?
Well, let me answer that for you.
Let people express themselves in their artistic forms.
Well, let me answer that for you, Scott, because if you have a playwright and he has created a play and he is selling to you a evening experiencing his play and he's saying you're going to have a good time and you're going to enjoy this form of art that I am expressing. But the form of art is in fact reflecting immoral and unsavory behaviors of men that you wouldn't in your darkest moments wish to reflect. By experiencing that thing that is 3 degrees removed from the truth, you're now getting permission from society to behave the way that you ought not to. And so
that's a fallacy.
When you experience things that are bad, you consume bad experiences and you have proof and justification that perhaps that's a way that you're allowed to behave.
I think you're more likely to commit atrocities if you're entirely ignorant of those atrocities and think you're doing something new, when in reality you're falling into an old pattern that multitudes of people have fallen into before.
Don't get me wrong. I don't agree with what they were saying, but I am trying to express their point, because this is the argument of the shooters of Columbine became the way they are because they listened to Nine Inch Nails.
Yeah, but that's like saying...
Or that video games cause people to murder.
Yeah, that's a good example too.
And I'm saying, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. It hasn't. There's no relation.
This is just something that I fundamentally really disagree with Plato. For all the good he did for us, I do not like censorship at all. I grew up listening to Frank Zappa and George Carlin, so censorship has no place in society as far as I'm concerned.
No, I agree entirely. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, don't take people's rights away with what you're expressing. And the calls to violence are illegal. They're not freedom of speech.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you should have a safe space where you can express yourself and share your opinions without being persecuted, so long as what you're doing does not take away the rights of others.
Agreed. How we reached that
Yep.
point is another matter.
Yeah.
Plato had an honorable attempt here, but I think we can always do better.
Well, and that ties into what I was saying earlier. His belief that personality traits are just who you are, that there are type A's and type B's, that there are good men and there are bad men, that the content that you feed into a person makes them the man that you want them to be. I disagree. I empirically disagree with that notion. Anyone can become anything, exceptions being mental health. And that's where I disagree with him, is that he thinks that if you filter the content that goes into the training, you will get a good person. But it's like the example that I brought up a couple times now. You have an alcoholic father who has 2 children. They live their entire childhood experiencing this alcoholic behavior. One of them becomes an alcoholic. One of them never drinks a day in their life. They had the same content and completely inverse reactions. You cannot control the output by censoring the input. You have to have free will. You have to give them resources. They have to be able to come to their own conclusions. They have to want to change in order to grow.
So that's a good spot to start talking about Plato's model of the soul, in which he envisions a many-headed monster which changes forms, being the largest part of the soul, then a lion, being the next largest, and another man, being the smallest portion of the soul, all joined into one, wrapped in the image of a man.
Which was an interesting metaphor.
I think we talked about it in the other dialogues.
Yeah, we might have. But it kind of reminds me of the different sections of the brain, you know? Like maybe that many-headed monster is just the reptile part of the brain.
Yeah, the different hemispheres. It just kind of goes back to finding harmony, you know?
It makes me think of a quote from the movie Tomorrowland. Have you guys seen that one?
No, I
No.
haven't.
It's George Clooney, and it's loosely based on Walt Disney's dream of building Epcot, the experimental project community of tomorrow, which is a utopian city where all of the brightest minds have access to all of the resources to push the human race forward and aren't limited by wealth or legislature. And the quote is this: "There's 2 wolves inside you, a good one and a bad one. Which one wins? The one you feed."
I have
Now
heard
that's
that
all-
before.
Well, that's only a 2 part construct, but I think it makes a good point. Whereas with this one, we've got the lion, the beast, and the man. And I kind of got confused by the lion.
I think that was supposed to represent like courage or
Bravery.
Well, that's what I figured, because I've seen Yellow Brick Road.
yeah.
Wizard of Oz.
There it is. Oh, I'm off kilter.
This was a giant rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I said it in the first part. I can say it again. This was a giant rabbit hole, but very, very interesting.
Oh, move over, Pat. I'm coming over to your side. Like metaphor after metaphor. I got lost in this one.
Speaking of metaphors, the last part of this book wraps up with the myth of What'd you guys think of that one?
It was weird.
What I got out of it was how to remain virtuous in connection to different forms that are worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's one can find something intimate, the other one can find a different form of intimacy, but the aim is just finding and instituting a level of order and harmony. That's what I got out of the last part. And how one chooses a good life is up to them. And after all the arguments going back and forth from the previous books that we've gone over, it eventually ends at that point.
Yeah, and I think the most ironic part about it is that they spend 10 books bashing poetry and imitation, and then they finish off by saying, well, this tale of the underworld, this one's chill. We'll include this one.
Yeah, that is the irony that is Plato, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I found it odd. It was a very interesting story, but like it seemed out of place that they threw this in as their closing remarks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all happened very fast. But then again, I guess they had to end it somehow.
Yeah. What did you think, Scott? Do you have any extra comments on this? Because you've been excited about it for a while.
I just thought it was really weird. I obviously am not a believer in any afterlife, like I say in every video that we make that mentions such topics, but I thought it was really cool in the way that it demonstrated that when we die, we actually choose how we're going to be reincarnated next. And it's because of the ignorance of our past that we move into the future, because it demonstrates the guy that went through life perfectly fine and didn't have a struggle, and he was the first in line to pick his next lot in life, and he picked that of a tyrant, and it didn't take him long to figure out that he had just doomed himself.
And short or less to blame God.
Mm-hmm.
And then Odysseus chose the life of a simple man.
Yeah, and he said he would have picked the same one if he was first or last to pick, because he knew exactly what life had to offer, and he knew exactly what he wanted from it.
That was nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I found the simile of the large and powerful animal.
Okay, why don't you share that with us, Will?
All right. There is a large and powerful animal which, when pleased, is happy and calm, and when displeased, is angry and enraged. A man, through trial and observation, learns what makes the animal happy and what displeases it, and so effectively tames the animal through this knowledge. He reduces this knowledge to an art and tries to pass it on to others. He takes that which makes the animal happy to be good and what makes it unhappy to be bad, and so frames good and bad on the responses and desires of the animal. He does not have the knowledge of what is actually good and bad. The animal is the large demos, which only responds to what it wants to hear, or society at large. The man is the sophist who controls the people through persuasion and by pandering to their desires. Plato compares the situation to democracy and says that they are the same. The people do not know what is actually good for them, and the sophist that controls them does not care. He only cares for being in power. Plato says that under democracy, we are subject to the unruly voice of the majority, and that it is not an effective form of rule, as the masses are uneducated and do not possess the knowledge of what is best. Only the philosopher with the knowledge of the good knows this.
All right. I like that.
Plato uses the simile to highlight the problems of democracy, why the philosopher who has the knowledge of the good should be the true ruler. I really liked it. I'm really upset that you guys didn't, because it was really interesting.
I think something like that is somewhere in mine, but I guess
Yeah,
I
and
just
again,
didn't pick up on it.
Yeah, and again, I don't recall seeing that.
Well,
But at least you saved us, Will.
got your back, boys.
The added perks of having two different translations, or two or three different translations.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to pick up a newer version. My translation is now like 66 years old.
Well,
I'm not sure how old mine is. Well, I'm pretty much all set for this one, unless you all have other comments.
Yeah, I'm ready to wrap this one up.
Yeah, in closing, let me ask you this question. Philosophy, who needs it?
All of us.
Everyone.
Yep.
May the force be with you.
And also equal to mass times acceleration.
Poof, poof.